Chapter 12, Part 1 of A History of the Philippines. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Elliot Miller. A History of the Philippines by David Barrows. Chapter 12, Part 1. Progress and Revolution, 1837 to 1897. Progress during the last half-century of Spanish rule. We have now come to the last half-century and to the last phase of Spanish rule. In many respects, this period was one of economic and social progress, and contained more of a promise than any other in the history of the islands. During this last half-century, the Spanish rulers had numerous plans for the development and better administration of the Philippines, and, in spite of a somewhat wavering policy and the continual soar of official peculation, this was a period of wonderful advancement. Revolution and separation from Spain came at last, as revolutions usually do, not because there was no effort nor movement for reform, but because progress was so discouragingly slow and so irritatingly blocked by established interests that desired no change. Effective opening the port of Manila to foreign trade. Increase in agriculture. The opening of the port of Manila to foreign trade in 1837 was followed by a period of rising industry and prosperity. Up to this time the archipelago had been a country producing for export, but the freeing of trade led to the rising of great harvests of foreign export, which have made worldwide the fame of certain Philippine productions. Chief among these are, of course, Manila hemp and tobacco. These were followed by sugar and coffee culture, the latter plant enriching the province of Batangas, while the planting of new coconut groves yearly made of greater importance the yield of that excellent product, copra. These rich merchandises had entered very little into commerce during the early decades of the century. Increase in exports. In 1810, the entire imports of the Philippines amounted in value to $5,329,000. But more than half of this consisted of silver sent from Mexico. From Europe and the United States trade amounted to only $175,000. The exports in the same year amounted to $4,795,000, but $1.5 million of this was Mexican silver exported on to China, and the whole amount of exports to Europe and the United States was only $250,000. In 1831, the exportation of hemp amounted to only 346 tons, but the effect upon production of opening Manila to foreign trade is seen in the export 6 years later of 2,585 tons. By 1858, the exportation of hemp had risen to 412,000 pickles, or 27,500 tons. Of this amount, nearly two-thirds, or 298,000 pickles, went to the United States. At this time, the North Atlantic seaboard of America was the center of a most active shipbuilding and ship-carrying trade. The American flag was conspicuous among the vessels that frequented these eastern ports, and Manila hemp was largely sought after by American seamen to supply the shipyards at home. Of sugar, the export in 1858 amounted to 557,000 pickles, of which more than half went to Great Britain. After 1814, general permission had been given to foreigners to establish trading houses in Manila, and by 1858 there were 15 such establishments, of which 7 were English and 3 American. Other ports opened to foreign commerce. In 1855, 3 other ports were opened to foreign commerce: Sual in Pangasinan on the Gulf of Lingayen, Iloilo, and Zamboanga. In 1863, Cebu likewise was made an open port. The exports of Sual consisted only of rice, and in spite of its exceptional harbor this port never flourished, and is this day no more than an unfrequented village. Iloilo exported leaf tobacco, sugar, sapan or dyewood (an industry long ago ruined), hemp, and hides. Zamboanga, through the Chinese, had a small trade with the Jolo and the Moro Islands, and exported the produce of these seas: sea slug, tripang, shark fins, mother of pearl, tortoise shell, etc. For some years the customs laws in these ports were trying and vexatious, and prevented full advantage being taken of the privileges of export. But in 1869 this service was, by royal decree, greatly liberalized and improved. Since that date the Philippines have steadily continued to grow in importance in the commercial world. The form of government under the Spanish. General improvements. This is perhaps a convenient place to examine the last time the political system which the Spaniards maintained in the country. In 1850 there were 34 provinces and 2 politico-military comandancias. In these provinces the Spanish administration was still vested solely in the alcalde mayor, who until after 1886 was both governor or executive officer and the judge or court for the trial of provincial cases and crimes. Many of the old abuses which had characterized the government of the alcaldes had been at least partially remedied. After 1844 they had no longer the much abused monopoly privilege of trade, nor had they as free a hand in controlling the labor of the inhabitants, but opportunities for illegal enrichment existed in administration of the treasury and tax system, and these opportunities were not slighted. Up to the very end of Spanish rule the officials, high and low, are accused of stealing public money. The Pueblo. The unit of administration was the pueblo or township, which ordinarily embraced many square miles of country and contained numerous villages, or barrios. The center of the town was naturally the site where for centuries had stood the great church and the convent of the missionary friars. These locations had always been admirably chosen, and about them grew up the market and trading shops of Chinese and the fine and durable homes of the more prosperous Filipinos and mestizos. About 1860 the government began to concern itself with the construction of public buildings and improvements, and the result is seen in many pueblos in the finely laid out plazas and well built municipal edifices grouped about the square of the tribunal, or town house, the jail, and the small but significant schoolhouses. The government of the town was vested in a gobernadorcillo and a council, each of the concejales usually representing a hamlet or barrio. But the Spanish friar, who in nearly every pueblo was the parish curate, continued to be the paternal guardian and administrator of the pueblo. In general, no matter was too minute for his dictation. Neither gobernadorcillo nor councillors dared act in opposition to his wishes, and the alcalde of the province was careful to keep on friendly terms and leave town affairs largely to his dictation. The friar was the local inspector of public instruction, and ever vigilant to detect and destroy radical ideas. To the humble Filipino, the friar was the visible and only representative of Spanish authority. The Revolt of 1841. Repression of the people by the friars. Unquestionably, in the past, the work of the friars had been of very great value. But men as well as institutions may lose their usefulness, as conditions change, and the time was now approaching when the autocratic and paternal regime of the friars no longer satisfied the Filipinos. Their zeal was no longer disinterested, and their work had become materialized by the possession of the vast estates upon which their spiritual charges lived and labored as tenants or dependents. The policy of the religious orders had, in fact, become one of repression, and as the aspirations of the Filipinos increased, the friars, filled with doubt and fear, tried to draw still tighter the bonds of their own authority, and viewed with growing distrust the rising ambition of the people. Apolinario de la Cruz. The unfortunate revolution of 1841 shows the wayward and misdirected enthusiasm of the Filipino, and the unwisdom of the friars. Apolinario de la Cruz, a young Filipino, a native of Lucban, Tayabas, came up to Manila filled with the ambition to lead a monastic life, and engaged high theological studies. By his attendance upon lectures and sermons, and by imitation of the friar preachers of Manila, Apolinario became himself quite an orator, and, as subsequent events showed, was about to arouse great numbers of his own people by his appeals. It was his ambition to enter one of the regular monastic orders, but this religious privilege was never granted to Filipinos, and he was refused. He then entered a brotherhood known as the Cofradia, or Brotherhood of San Juan de Dios, composed entirely of Filipinos. After some years in this brotherhood, he returned in 1840 to Tayabas and founded the Cofradia de San Jose, his aim being to form a special cult in honor of Saint Joseph and the Virgin. For this he requested authorization from Manila. It was here that the lack of foresight of the friars appeared. The opposition of the friars. Instead of sympathizing with these religious aspirations, in which, up to this point, there seems to have been nothing heretical, they viewed the rise of the Filipino religious leader with alarm. Their policy never permitted to the Filipino any position that was not wholly subordinate. They believed that the permanence of Spanish power in these islands lay in suppressing any latent ability for leadership in the Filipino himself. Their influence, consequently, was thrown against Apolinario and the granting of the authority for his work. They secured not only a condemnation of his plan, but an order for the arrest and imprisonment of all who should attend upon his preaching. Apolinario forced to rebel. Apolinario thereupon took refuge in independent action. His movement had already become a strong one, and his followers numbered several thousand people of Laguna, Tayabas, and Batangas. The governor of Tayabas province, Don Joaquin Ortega, organized an expedition to destroy the schism. Accompanied by 2 Franciscan friars, he attacked Apolinario in the month of October 1840 and was defeated and killed. One account says that Apolinario was assisted by a band of Negritos, whose bowmanship was destructive. There are still a very few of these little blacks in the woods in the vicinity of Lucban. Apolinario was now in the position of an open rebel, and he fortified himself in the vicinity of Aleteo, where he built a fort and chapel. His religious movement became distinctly independent and heretical. A church was formed, of which he was first elected archbishop and then supreme pontiff. He was also charged with having assumed the title of King of the Tagalogs. Finally, a force under the new alcalde, Vital, and General Huet early in November attacked Apolinario's stronghold, and after a fierce struggle defeated the revolutionists. About 1,000 Filipinos perished in the final battle. Apolinario was captured and executed. He was then 27 years of age. Organization of Municipal Governments. In 1844, an able and liberal governor, General Claveria, arrived and remained until the end of the year 1849. A better organization of the provincial governments, which we have seen, followed Claveria's entrance into office, and in October 1847 came the important decree organizing the municipalities in the form which we have already described, and which remained without substantial modification to the end of the Spanish rule, and which has to a considerable extent been followed in the municipal code framed by the American government. Subjection of the Igorot tribes. With Claveria began a decisive policy of conquest among the Igorot tribes of northern Luzon, and by the end of Spanish rule these mountains were dotted with cuartels and missions for the control of these unruly tribes. The province of Nueva Vizcaya has been particularly subject to the raids of these headhunting peoples. Year after year, the Christian towns of the plains had yielded a distressing sacrifice of life to satisfy the savage ceremonials of the Igorots. In 1847, Claveria nominated as governor of Nueva Vizcaya Don Mariano Oscariz, whose severe and telling conquest for the first time checked these Nueva Vizcaya outrages and made possible the development of the great valleys of northern Luzon. Spanish settlements on Mindanao, Ziquari-Boanga. With Claveria's governorship, we enter also upon the last phase of Moro piracy. In spite of innumerable expeditions, Spain's occupation of South Mindanao and the Sulu archipelago was limited to the presidio of Zamboanga. She had occupied this strategic point continuously since the re-establishment of Spanish power in 1763. The great stone fort, which still stands, has proved impregnable to Moro attack, and had long been unmolested. Distributed for a distance of some miles over the rich lands at this end of the Zamboanga Peninsula was a Christian population, which had grown up largely from the descendants of rescued captives of the Moros. Coming originally from all parts of the Bisayas, Calamianes, and Luzon, this mixed population had grown to have somewhat different character from that of any other part of the islands. A corrupt Spanish dialect, known as the Chabucano, has become the common speech, the only instance in the Philippines where the native dialect has been supplanted. This population, loyal and devoutedly Catholic, never failed to sustain the defense of this isolated Spanish outpost, and contributed brave volunteers to every expedition against the Moro Islands. Activity of other nations. But Spain's maintenance of Zamboanga was insufficient to sustain her claims of sovereignty over the Sulu and Tawi-Tawi groups. Both the Dutch and English planned various moves for their occupation and acquisition, and in 1844 a French fleet entered the archipelago and concluded a treaty with the Sultan of Sulu for the cession of the island of Basilan for the sum of $1,000,000. Writings of the French minister and historian M. Guizot show that France hoped by the acquisition of this island to obtain a needed naval joss in the east and found a great commercial port within the sphere of Chinese trade. Conquest of the Gulf of Davao. But this step roused the Spaniards to activity and the occupation of the island. A naval vessel subdued the towns along the north coast, and then, proceeding to the mouth of the Rio Grande, secured from the Sultan of Maguindanao the cession of the great Gulf of Davao. Spain took no immediate steps to occupy this gulf, but in 1847 a Spaniard, Don Jose Oyanguran, proposed to the governor, Claveria, to conquer the region at his own expense, if he could be furnished with artillery and munitions and granted a 10 years' government of Davao, with the exclusive privilege of trade. His offer was accepted by the governor and the Audiencia, and Oyanguran organized the company to secure funds for the undertaking. In 2 years' time he had subdued the coast regions of this gulf, expelled the pirates who harbored there, and founded the settlement of Nueva Vallarta. He seems to have been making progress toward the conquest and commercial exploitation of this region, when jealous attacks in Manila induced Governor Orbitstondo to cancel his privilege and to relieve him by an officer of the government. In subsequent years the Jesuits had a few mission stations here and made a few converts among the Bagabos, but the region is still an unsubdued and unutilized country, whose inhabitants are mainly pagan tribes and whose rich agricultural possibilities lie undeveloped and unclaimed. The Samal Pirates, the Sulu. The piratical inhabitants of the Sulu archipelago are made of two distinct Malayan peoples, the Sulu, or Sulug, and the Samal, who are known throughout Malaysia as the Baojao, or Orang Laut, men of the sea. The former appear to be the older inhabitants. They occupy the rich and populous island of Jolo and some islands of the Siasi group, immediately south. The Samal. The Samal, or Bajau, are stated to have come originally from Johore. Many of them live almost exclusively in their boats, passing their lives from birth to death upon the sea. They are found throughout most parts of Malaysia, the position of their little fleets changing with the shifting of the monsoons. In the Sulu archipelago and a few points in South Mindanao, many of these Samal have shifted their homes from their boats to the shore. Their villages are built upon piles over the sea, and on many of the low coral reefs south of Siasi and east of Tawi-Tawi there are great towns or settlements which have apparently been in existence a long while. 50 years ago, the Samal were very numerous in the many islands between Jolo and Basilan, and this group is still known as the Islas Samales. Like the Sulu and other Malays, The Samal are Mohammedans and scarcely less persistent pirates than their fellow Malays. With the decline of piratical power among the Sulu of Jolo, the focus of piracy shifted to these settlements of the Samal, and in the time of Claveria the worst centers were the islands of Balangingi and Tonkel, lying just north of the island of Jolo. From here pirate and slaving raids upon the Bisayan Islands continued to be made, and nearly every year towns were sacked and burned and several hundred unfortunate captives carried away. The captives were destined for slavery, and regular marts existed for this traffic at Jolo and on the Bay of Sandakan in Borneo. Arrival of steam warships. In 1848 the Philippines secured the first steam war vessels. These were the Magallanes, the Elcano, and the Reina de Castilla. They were destined to revolutionize Moro relations. The destruction of the Samal forts. Hitherto it had been possible for the great Moro war praus, manned by many oarsmen, to drop their masts on the approach of an armed sailing vessel, and, turning toward the eye of the wind, where no sailing ship could pursue, row calmly away from danger. Steam alone was effective in combating these sea wolves. Claveria took these newly arrived ships, and, with a strong force of infantry which was increased by Zamboanga volunteers, he entered the Samal group in February 1848 and landed on the island of Balangingi. There were 4 fortresses situated in the mangrove marshes of the island. These, in spite of a desperate resistance, were carried by the infantry and Zamboangueños, and the pirates scattered. The conduct of the campaign appears to have been admirable and the fighting heroic. The Moros were completely overwhelmed. 450 dead were burned or interred. 124 pieces of artillery, for the most part the small brass cannon called the intacas, were captured, and 150 Moro boats were destroyed. The Spaniards cut down the coconut groves, and with spoil that included such rich pirate loot as silks, silver vases, ornaments, and weapons of war, and with over 200 prisoners and 300 rescued captives, returned to Zamboanga. This was the most signal victory ever won by Europeans in conflict with Malay piracy. The effectiveness of this campaign is shown by the fact that while in the preceding year 450 Filipinos had suffered capture at the hands of Moro pirates, in 1848 and the succeeding year there was scarcely a depredation. But in 1850 a pirate squadron from Tonkel, an island adjacent to Balangingi, fell upon Samar and Camagin. Fortunately, Governor Urbiztondo, who had succeeded Claveria, vigorously continued the policy of his predecessor, and an expedition was promptly dispatched which destroyed the settlements and strongholds on Tonkel. Destruction of the Moro forts at Jolo. A year later war broke out again with Jolo, and after a varied interchange of negotiations and hostilities, the Spaniards stormed and took the town in February 1851. The question of permanent occupation of this important site was debated by a council of war, but their forces appearing unequal to the task, the forts of the Moros were destroyed, and the expedition returned. Jolo is described at this tune as a very strongly guarded situation. 5 forts and a double line of trenches faced the shore. The Moro town is said to have contained about 7,000 souls, and there was a barrio of Chinese traders, who numbered about 500. Treaty Irigit the Sultan of Sulu. A few months later, the governor of Zamboanga concluded a treaty with the Sultan of Sulu by which the archipelago was to be considered an incorporated part of the Spanish possessions. The Sultan bound himself to make no further treaties with or cessions to foreign powers, to suppress piracy, and to fly the Spanish flag. Moros were guaranteed the practice of their religion, the succession of the Sultan and his descendants in the established order. Boats of Jolo were to enjoy the same trading privileges in Spanish ports as other Filipino vessels, and the Sultan retained the right to all customs duties on foreign trading vessels. Finally, in compensation for the damages of war, the Sultan was to be paid an annual subsidy of 1,500 pesos and 600 pesos each to 3 datos and 360 pesos to a sharif. The End of Malay Piracy. In these very years that Malay piracy was receiving such severe blows from the recuperating power and activity of the Spanish government on the north, it was crushed also from the south by the merciless warfare of a great Englishman, the Rajah James Brooks of Sarawak. The sources of pirate depredation were Mindanao, the Sulu archipelago, and the north and west coast of the great island of Borneo. We have seen how these fleets, century after century, swept northward and wasted with fire and murder the fair islands of the Philippines. But this archipelago was not alone in suffering these ravages. The peaceful trading inhabitants of the great island groups to the south were persistently visited and despoiled. Moreover, as the Chinese trade by the Cape of Good Hope route became established in the first half of the 19th century, these pirates became a great menace to European shipping. They swarmed the China Sea, and luckless indeed was the ship carried too far eastward on its course. Every American schoolboy is familiar with the stories of fierce hand-to-hand struggles with Malay pirates, which have come down from those years when the American flag was seen everywhere in the ports of the Far East. About 1839, a young English officer, who had been in the Indian service, James Brooke, having armed and equipped a yacht of about 140 tons, set sail for the coast of Borneo, with the avowed intent of destroying Malay piracy and founding an independent state. In all the romantic stories of the East, there is no career of greater daring than that of this man. In 1841, having engaged in several bloody exploits, Brooke forced from the Sultan of Borneo the cession of Sarawak, with the government vested in himself as an independent rajah. Brooke now devoted himself with merciless severity to the destruction of the pirates in the deep bays and swampy rivers, whence they had so long made their excursions. Later, he was assisted by the presence of the English man-of-war Dido, and in 1847 the Sultan of Brunei ceded to Great Britain the island of Labuan. In 1849, Brooke visited Zamboanga in the English man-of-war Mosander, and concluded a treaty with the Sultan of Sulu, which greatly alarmed the Spaniards. Brooke's private correspondence shows that he was ambitious and hopeful of acquiring for England parts of the Dutch possessions in the south and the Spanish Philippines in the north, but his plans were never followed up by England, although in 1887 North Borneo was ceded to an English company, and all the northern and eastern portions of this great island are now under English protection. Liberal Ideas Among the Filipinos. The release from Moro piracy, the opening of foreign commerce, and the development of agricultural production were rapidly bringing about a great change in the aspirations of the Filipino people themselves. Nearly up to the middle of the 19th century, the Filipinos had felt the full effect of isolation from the life and thought of the modern world. But the revolutionary changes in Europe and the struggles for constitutional government in Spain had their influence, even in these faraway Spanish possessions. Spaniards of liberal ideas, some of them in official positions, found their way to the islands, and an agitation began, originating among Spaniards themselves against the paternal powers of the friars. Influence of the Press. The growth of periodic literature accelerated this liberalizing movement. The press, though suffering a severe censorship, had played a large part in shaping recent thought in these islands and in communicating to the Filipino people those ideas and purposes which ever inspire and elevate men. The first newspaper to make its appearance in the Philippines was in 1822 El Filantropo, but journalism assumed no real importance until the 40s, when there were founded Seminario Filipino, 1843, and almost immediately after several others, El Amigo de País, 1845, La Estrella, 1846, and La Esperanza, 1847, the first daily. These were followed by Diario de Manila, 1848. In 1858, El Comercio appeared, the oldest of the papers still in existence. Papers conducted by Filipinos and in the Filipino tongues are of more recent origin. But these early Spanish periodicals had a real effect upon the Filipinos themselves, training up a class familiar with the conduct of journalism and preparing a way for the very influential work of the Filipino press in recent years. End of Chapter 12, Part 1. Of A History of the Philippines. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Elliot Miller. A History of the Philippines by David Barrows. Chapter 12, Part 2. Establishment of an educational system. Return of the Jesuits. But more important than all other influences was the opening of education to Filipinos. In 1852, a royal decree authorized the Jesuits to return to the Philippines. The conditions under which they came back were that they should devote themselves solely to missions in the unoccupied fields of Mindanao and to the higher education of the Filipinos, the public schools. In 1863, Concha, the Spanish Minister of War and Colonies, Ultramar, decreed the system of public primary instruction. A primary school for boys and one for girls was to be established in each pueblo of the islands. In these schools, instruction was to be given in the Spanish language. A superior commission of education was formed, which consisted of the governor, the archbishop, and 7 other members, added by the governor himself. The system was not secular, for it primarily was devoted to the teaching of religious doctrine. The Spanish friar, the pueblo curate, was the local inspector of schools and practically directed their conduct. It was not wholly a free system, because tuition was required of all but the poorest children. Nor was it an adequate system, because even when the most complete, it reached only a small proportion of the children of a parish, and these very largely were of the well-to-do families, and yet this system, for what it accomplished, is deserving of praise. Besides the church, the convent, and the tribunal, nearly every town in the Philippines, toward the close of Spanish rule, had also, in the public plaza, its public school buildings for boys and for girls. In these towns, a number of Filipinos were taught to converse in the Spanish language, and at least the rudiments of Spanish education. But this system did not give opportunity for education to the little child of the humble fisherman and the husbandman. The Manila Normal School. To prepare Filipino teachers to do this work of primary instruction, a decree of 1863 established the Manila Normal School. In charge of the Jesuits, this school was inaugurated January 1865. And about the same date, the government decreed the foundation of the Jesuit Ateneo Municipal for higher instruction in the classics and sciences that should conduct the student to the degree of Bachelor of Arts. The influence of these institutions upon the development of the Filipino has been remarkable. In one or the other of them has been trained nearly all those young men who in recent years have stirred the Filipino people to wide ambitions and demands. At the same time, the excellent Jesuit Observatory, which has done such important work in meteorology, was established in charge of Padre Fuara. Increase in Spanish population. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 brought immense changes to the islands. Previous to this date, Spanish residents had been few. Almost the only class deeply interested in the islands and permanently established here had been the friars. But with communication by steamer in 30 days from Barcelona to Manila, a new interest was felt by Spaniards in the Philippines, though, unfortunately, this interest was greatest among the politicians. Some of the projects planned and decreed can only be regarded as visionary and beyond the point of serviceability, and others, more unfortunately still, had for their purpose the creation of offices and annulments of Peninsula politicians. But they all contributed to bring to an end the paternal government under which there was no prospect of further enlightenment or progress for the Filipino. Increase in the number of wealthy, educated Filipinos. The Filipino had now become embarked upon a new current of intellectual experience.
a course of enlightenment which had been so full of unexpected development, and which has already carried him far from his ancestor of 100 years ago, that we cannot say what advance another generation or two may bring. Throughout all the towns of the islands a class was rapidly growing, up to which the new industries had brought wealth. Their means enabled them to build spacious and splendid homes of the fine hard woods of the Philippines, and to surround themselves with such luxuries as the life of the islands permitted. This class was rapidly gaining education. It acquired a knowledge of the Spanish language, and easily assumed the graceful courtesy which distinguishes the Spaniard. The only misfortune, as regards this class, was that it was very small. It could embrace but a few families in each populous town. Some of these had Chinese and Spanish blood in their veins, but other notable families were pure Filipinos. Attitude of the Spanish and the Friars toward Filipino education. The great mistake committed by the Spaniard was that he rarely welcomed the further progress of the native population, and the center of this opposition to the general enlightenment of the race was the Friars. Thus those who had been the early protectors and educators, little by little, because of their extreme conservatism, and their fear of loosening the ties that bound the Filipino to the Church and to Spain, changed into opponents of his progress and enemies of his enlightenment. But the education which the Church itself had given to the Filipino, and which had been fostered by the state and especially in recent times by the Jesuits, had made the Filipino passionately ambitious for more enlightenment and freedom. The rule of Governor Torre. Liberal reforms. In 1868, Queen Isabella II of Spain was deposed, and a little later a revolutionary government, the Republic of Spain, was founded. It was a brief triumph of that reforming and liberal spirit which for so many years had been struggling to free Spain from the burdens of aristocracy and ecclesiasticism. The natural consequence was the sending of a liberal governor to the Philippines and the publication of liberal principles and reforms. This governor was General de la Torre. He was a brave and experienced soldier, and a thorough democrat at heart. He dispensed with the formality and petty pomp with which the governors of Manila had surrounded themselves. He dismissed the escort of halberdiers with their medieval uniforms and weapons, which had surrounded the governors general since 1581, and rode out in civilians' clothes and without ostentation. His efforts were directed to encouraging the Filipinos, and to attaching them to Spain. In the eyes of the Spanish law, for a brief period, Spaniard and colonist had become equal, and La Torre tried to enforce this principle and make no distinction of race or birth. While Filipinos were encouraged and delighted, it is impossible to describe the disgust of the Spanish population and the opposition of the friars. La Torre was attacked and opposed, and the entire course of his governorship was filled with trouble, in which naturally liberal ideas gained wider and wider currency among the Filipinos. Effect of the opposition of the friars. The friars, being the most influential opponents of the Filipino, naturally came to be regarded by the Filipinos as their greatest enemies, and the anti-friar spirit daily spread and intensified. A party was formed which demanded that friars vacate the parishes, and that their places be filled by secular priests, in accordance with the statutes of the Council of Trent. This party was headed by the native priests, Dr. Jose Burgos and Father Gomez. A Filipino movement for reform. After the fall of the Republic in Spain, and the restoration of the monarchy, the administration in the Philippines attempted to extirpate the rising tide of liberal thought. But these ideas had taken root and could not be suppressed. The Filipino party, if so we may call it, continued to plan and work for reform. It numbered not only those of Filipino blood, but many of Spanish descent born in the Philippines. There is no certain evidence that they were at this time plotting for independence, or that their actions were treasonable, but the fear and hatred felt by the Spaniards resulted frequently in the exile and punishment of known advocates of reform. The Cavite revolt. In 1872 there occurred an important outbreak known as the Cavite revolt. 200 native soldiers at the Cavite arsenal rose, killed their officers, and shouted "Death to Spain!" They had fellow conspirators among the troops in Manila, but, owing to mistakes in their plans, these failed to rise with them, and the revolt was easily suppressed. It was immediately followed by the arrest of a large number of Filipinos, who had been conspicuous in La Torre's time and who were advocates of reform. These number included the three priests, Father Burgos, Zamora, and Gomez, besides Dr. Antonio Regidor, Don Joaquin Pardo de Tavera, Don Puelo Quero, and others. A council of war condemned to death 41 of the participants in the Cavite riot, and these were shot on the morning of the 27th of January, 1872, on the field of Bagumbayan. On the 6th of February, a council of war condemned to death 11 more soldiers of the regiment of artillery, but this sentence was commuted by the governor to life imprisonment. On the 15th of February, the same council of war sentenced to death upon the garrote the priests Burgos, Zamora, Gomez, and a countryman, Saldua, and this sentence was executed on the morning of the 17th. The spread of secret organizations, Masonry. New ground for fear was now found in the spread of secret organizations, which were denounced as Freemasonry. This is a very ancient institution which, in Protestant countries like England and America, has a very large membership, and in these countries its aims are wholly respectable. It has never in any way been connected with sedition or other unworthy movements. Its services are, in fact, largely of a religious character, and it possesses a beautiful and elaborate Christian ritual. But in Latin countries, Masonry has been charged with political intrigue and the encouragement of infidelity, and this has resulted in clerical opposition to the order wherever found. The first Masonic lodge in the Philippines was established about 1861, and was composed entirely of Spaniards. It was succeeded by others with Filipino membership, and in one way or another seems to have inspired many secret organizations, which were formed some years later. The Association Hispano-Filipina. Large numbers of Filipinos were now working, if not for independence, at least for the expulsion of the friars, and while this feeling should have been met by a statesmanlike and liberal policy of reform, the government constantly resorted to measures of repression, which little by little changed the movement for reformation into revolution. In 1888, the Association Hispano-Filipina was formed by a number of the younger Filipino patriots and students in Spain. Their object was Philippine reform. The most famous of this group, who gained a supreme place in the hearts of Filipinos and in the history of the islands, was Dr. Jose Rizal y Macardo. He was born in 1861 at Calamba, on Laguna de Bay, and even as a child he was affected with sadness at the memory of the events of 1872 and with the backward and unhappy condition of his countrymen. He was educated by the Jesuits at the Ateneo Municipal in Manila, and his family having means he was enabled to study in Spain, where he took a degree in medicine, and later to travel and study in France, England, and Germany. It was in this latter country he produced his first novel, Noli Me Tangere. He was also a contributor to the Filipino paper published in Spain, La Solidaridad. It was to bring the conditions and needs of his country to public notice that he wrote this novel dealing with Tagalog life as represented at his old home on Laguna de Bay and in the city of Manila. Later he published a sequel, El Filibusterismo, in which even more courageously and significantly are set forth his ideas for reform. His work made him many enemies, and on his return to Manila he found himself in danger and was obliged to leave. He returned again in 1892, founded La Liga Filipina, and was immediately arrested and sentenced to deportation to Dapitan, Mindanao. Here he remained quietly in exile for some years. The Katipunan. Meanwhile, the ideas which had been agitated by the wealthy and educated Filipinos had worked their way down to the poor and humble classes. They were now shared by the peasant and the fisherman, especially in those provinces where the religious orders owned estates and took as rental a portion of the tenant's crop. There was growing hatred and hostility to the friars. The Liga Filipina, had been composed of cultivated and moderate men, who while pressing for reform were not inclined to radical extremes, nor to obtain their ends by violent means. But there now grew up and gradually spread, until it had branches and members in all the provinces surrounding Manila, a secret association composed largely of the uneducated classes, whose object was independence of Spain, and whose members, having little to lose, were willing to risk all. This was the society which had since become famous under the name of Katipunan. This secret association was organized in Manila about 1892. Its president and founder was Andres Bonifacio. Its objects were frankly to expel the friars and, if possible, to destroy the Spanish government. Rebellion of 1896. A general attack and slaughter of the Spaniards was planned for the end of the year 1896. The plot was discovered by the priests of Binado, Padre Gil, who had learned of the movement through a sister of one of the conspirators, and within a few hours the government had seized several hundred persons who were supposed to be implicated. The arrests included many rich and prominent Filipinos, and at the end of some weeks the Spanish prisons contained several thousand suspects. Over 1,000 of these were almost immediately exiled to far distant Spanish prisons, Fernando Po, on the west coast of Africa, and the fortress of Ceuta on the Mediterranean. Meanwhile, the Katipunan was organizing its forces for struggle. On the 26th of August, a force of insurgents attacked Caloocan, and 4 days later a pitched battle was fought at San Juan del Monte. In this last fight the insurgents suffered a great loss. Their leader, Valenzuela, was captured, with 3 companions shot on the Campo de Bagumbayan. The rising continued, however, and the provinces of Pampanga, Bulacan, and Nueva Ecija were soon in full rebellion. The center of revolt, however, proved to be Cavite. This province was almost immediately cleared of Spaniards, except the long neck of land containing the town of Cavite and protected by the fleet. Here the insurgents received some organization under a young man who had been prominent in the Katipunan, Emilio Aguinaldo. The Governor General Blanco, a humane man, who afterwards for a short time commanded in Cuba, was recalled, and General Polavieja replaced him. The Spanish army at the beginning of the revolt had consisted of but 1,500 troops, but so serious was the revolt regarded that Spain, although straining every energy at the moment to end the rebellion in Cuba, strengthened the forces in the Philippines, until Polavieja had an army of 28,000 Spaniards assisted by several loyal Filipino regiments. With this army a fierce campaign in Cavite province was conducted, which after 52 days' hard fighting ended in the defeat of the insurgents and the scattering of their forces. Death of Dr. Rizal. For the moment it looked as though the rebellion might pass. Then the Spanish government of Polavieja disgraced itself by an act as wanton and cruel as it was inhuman and impolitic. 4 years Dr. Rizal had spent in exile at Dapitan. He had lived quietly and under surveillance, and it was impossible that he could have had any share in this rebellion of 1898. Wearied, however, with his inactivity, he solicited permission to go as an army doctor to the dreadful Spanish hospitals in Cuba. This request was granted in July, and Rizal had the misfortune to arrive in Manila at the very moment of discovery of the rebellion in August. Governor Blanco hastened to send him to Spain with a most kindly letter to the Minister of War, in which he vouched for his independence of the events which were taking place in Manila. His enemies, however, could not see him escape. Their persecution followed him to the peninsula, and upon his arrival in Spain, Rizal was at once arrested and sent back to Manila a prisoner. His friend Blanco had gone. Polavieja, the friend and tool of his reactionary party, was busy punishing by imprisonment, banishment, or death all Filipinos who could be shown to have had the slightest part or association in the movement for reform. And by this clique Dr. Rizal was sentenced to execution. He was shot early on the morning of December 30th, 1896. At his death, the insurrection flamed out afresh.
It now spread from Pangasinan, Zambales, and Ilocos.
End of the revolt by promises of reform. Polavieja returned to Spain and was succeeded by General Primo de Rivera, who arrived in the spring of 1897. The Spanish troops had suffered several recent reverses, and the country swarmed with insurgents. The policy of Primo de Rivera was to gain by diplomacy where the energy of his predecessor had failed. In July 1897, an amnesty proclamation was issued, and in August the governor-general opened negotiations with Aguinaldo, whose headquarters were now in the mountains of Angat in Bulacan. Primo de Rivera urged the home government to make some reforms which would greatly lessen the political importance of the friars. He was vehemently opposed by the latter, but it was probably in the hope of some reform that Aguinaldo and his fellow insurgents agreed, for the payment of 600,000 pesos, to surrender their arms, dismiss the insurgent forces, and themselves retire from the islands. This agreement was made, and on December 27, 1897, Aguinaldo left the port of Sual for Hong Kong. The Spanish misrule ended. Conditions in the provinces still continued very unsatisfactory, and in its very last hours the Spanish government lost the remnant of its prestige with the people by a massacre in Calacamba, Binondo, of a company of Bisayan sailors. 10 days after this occurrence a revolt blazed out on the island of Cebu. Had events taken their course, what would have been the final conclusion of the struggle between Spaniards and Filipinos it is impossible to say. In the month of April war was declared between Spain and the United States. On the first day of May an American fleet reached Manila Harbor, and then the naval fight off Cavite, Spanish dominion, which had lasted with only one brief interruption for 333 years, was ended. End of Chapter 12, Part 2.
Part 1 of A History of the Philippines. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Alma Molino. A History of the Philippines by David Barrows. Chapter 13, Part 1. Chapter 13, America and the Philippines. Beginning of a new era. With the passing of the Spanish sovereignty to the Americans, a new era began in the Philippines. Already the old Spanish rule seems so far removed that we can begin to think of it without feeling and study it without prejudice. Development of the United States of America. The American nation is the type of the New World. Beginning in a group of colonies planted half a century later than the settlement of the Philippines, it has had a development unparalleled in the history of states. Although peopled by emigrants from Europe who rigidly preserved both their purity of race and pride of ancestry, the American colonists at the end of a century were far separated in spirit and institutions from the Old World. Struggle with the wilderness and with the savage produced among them a society more democratic and more independent than Europe had ever known, while their profound religious convictions saved the colonists from barbarism and intellectual decline. It can truthfully be said that in 1775, at the outbreak of the American Revolution, the colonists had abler men and greater political ability than the mother country of England. It was these men who, at the close of the Revolution, framed the American Constitution, the greatest achievement in the history of public law. This nation, endowed at its commencement with so precious an inheritance of political genius, felt its civil superiority to the illiberal or ineffective governments of Europe, and this feeling has produced in Americans a supreme and traditional confidence in their own forms of government and democratic standards of life. Certainly their history contains much to justify the choice of their institutions. 125 years ago, these colonies were a small nation of 2,500,000 people, occupying no more than the Atlantic coast of the continent. Great mountain chains divided them from the interior, which was overrun by the fiercest and most warlike type of man that the races have produced, the American Indian. With an energy which has shown no diminishing from generation to generation, the American broke through these mountain chains, subdued the wilderness, conquered the Indian tribes, and in the space of 3 generations was master of the continent of North America. Even while engaged in the War for Independence, the American frontiersmen crossed the Appalachians and secured Kentucky and the Northwest Territory, and with them the richest and most productive regions of the temperate zone, the Mississippi Valley. In 1803, the great empire of Louisiana, falling from the hand of France, was added to the American nation. In 1818, Florida was ceded by Spain, and in 1848, as a result of war with Mexico, came the Greater West and the Pacific Seaboard. This vast dominion, nearly 3,000 miles in width from east to west, has been peopled by natural increase and by immigration from Europe, until, at the end of the 19th century, the American nation numbered 76 million souls. This development has taken place without fundamental change in the constitution or form of government, without loss of individual liberty, and with ever-increasing national prosperity. Moreover, the states have survived the Civil War, the most bloody and persistently fought war of all modern centuries, a war in which 1 million soldiers fell, and to sustain which $3.5 billion in gold were expended out of the national treasury. This war accomplished the abolition of Negro slavery, the greatest economic revolution ever effected by a single blow. Such in brief is the history of the American nation, so gifted with political intelligence, so driven by sleepless energy, so proud of its achievements, and inwardly so contemptuous of the more polished but less liberal life of the Old World. Europe has never understood this nation, and not until a few years ago did Europeans dream of its progress and its power. Relation of the United States to South American republics. Toward the republics of Spanish America, the United States has always stood in a peculiar relation. These countries achieved their independence of Spain under the inspiration of the success of the United States. Their governments were framed in imitation of the American, and in spite of the turbulence and disorder of their political life, the United States has always felt and manifested a strong sympathy for these states as fellow republics. She has moreover pledged herself to the maintenance of their integrity against the attacks of European powers. This position of the United States in threatening with resistance the attempt of any European power to seize American territory is known as the Monroe Doctrine, because it was first declared by President Monroe in 1823. Sympathy of American people for the oppressed Cubans. The fact that the American nation attained its own independence by revolution has made the American people give ready sympathy to the cause of the revolutionists. The people of Cuba, who made repeated ineffective struggles against Spanish sovereignty, always had the good wishes of the American people. By international law, however, one nation may not recognize or assist revolutionists against a friendly power until their independence is practically effected. Thus, when rebellion broke out afresh in Cuba in 1894, the United States government actively suppressed the lending of assistance to the Cubans, as was its duty, although the American people themselves heartily wished Cuba free. The war in Cuba dragged along for years and became more and more merciless. The passions of Cubans and Spaniards were so inflamed that quarter was seldom given, and prisoners were not spared. Spain poured her troops into the island until there were 120,000 on Cuban soil, but the rebellion continued. The Spanish have always been merciless in dealing with revolutionists. Americans, on the other hand, have always conceded the moral right of a people to resist oppressive government, and in the entire history of the United States, there has scarcely been a single punishment for political crime. Although probably the fiercest war in history was the American Civil War from 1861 to 1865, there was not a single execution for treason. Thus, the stories of the constant executions of political prisoners on an island in sight of its own shores greatly exasperated America, as did the policy of Governor-General Weyler, which was excessive in its severity. War with Spain. Destruction of the Main. As the contest proceeded without sign of termination, the patience of the American people grew less. Then, February 15, 1898, occurred one of the most deplorable events of recent times. The American battleship Maine, lying in the harbor of Havana, was in the night blown to destruction by mine or torpedo, killing 266 American officers and sailors. It is impossible to believe that so dastardly an act was done with the knowledge of the higher Spanish officials, but the American people rightly demanded that a government such as Spain maintained in Cuba, unable to prevent such an outrage upon the vessel of a friendly power, and that could neither suppress its rebellion nor wage war humanely, should cease. Declaration of War. On April 20th, the American Congress demanded that Spain withdraw from the island and recognize the independence of Cuba. This was practically a declaration of war. Spain indignantly refused and resolved upon resistance. Unfortunately, the ignorant European press claimed for Spain military and naval superiority. The war was brief and was an overwhelming disaster to Spain. Every vessel of her proud navy that came under the fire of American guns was destroyed. For a few months, battle raged along the coasts of Cuba, and then Spain sued for peace. Dewey's victory in Manila Bay. But meanwhile, the war, begun without the slightest reference to the Philippine Islands, had brought about surprising consequences here. At the opening of the war, both Spain and the United States had squadrons in Asiatic waters. The Spanish fleet lay at Cavite. The American ships gathered at Hong Kong. Immediately on the declaration of war, the American naval commander, Dewey, was ordered to destroy the Spanish fleet, which was feared on the Pacific coast of America. Dewey entered the Bay of Manila in darkness on the morning of May 1st, and made direct for the Spanish vessels at Cavite. His fleet was the more powerful and immeasurably the more efficient. In a few hours, the Spanish navy was utterly destroyed, and Manila lay at the mercy of his guns. A new insurrection under Aguinaldo. At this signal catastrophe to Spain, the smoldering insurrection in the islands broke out afresh. The Spanish troops not in Manila were driven in upon their posts, and placed in a position of siege. The friars, so hated by the revolutionists, were captured in large numbers, and were in some cases killed. With the permission and assistance of the American authorities, Aguinaldo returned from Singapore and landed at Cavite. Here he immediately headed anew the Philippine insurrection. Capture of Manila. Troops were dispatched from San Francisco for the capture of Manila. By the end of July, 8,500 men lay in the transports off Cavite. They were landed at the little estuary of Parañaque and advanced northwards upon Fort San Antonio and the defenses of Malate. The Spaniards behind the city's defenses, although outnumbering the Americans, were sick and dispirited. One attempt was made to drive back the invading army, but on the following day the Americans swept through the defenses and line of blockhouses, and Manila capitulated. August 13, 1898. The Filipinos had scarcely participated in the attack on the city, and they were excluded from occupying it after its surrender. This act was justified because the Filipino forces had been very recently raised, the soldiers were undisciplined, and had they entered the city, with passions inflamed as they were, it was feared by the Americans that their officers might not be able to keep them from looting and crime. Misunderstanding between Americans and Filipinos. Up to this point, the relations between the American and Filipino armies had been friendly. But here began that misunderstanding and distrust which for so many months were to alienate these two peoples and embitter their intercourse. Provisional Government of the Filipinos. In the interval between the destruction of the Spanish fleet and the capture of Manila, the Filipinos in Cavite had organized a provisional government and proclaimed the independence of the archipelago. American ideas in regard to the Philippines. The idea of returning these islands to the Spanish power was exceedingly repugnant to American sentiment. Spain's attitude toward revolutionists was well understood in America, and the Filipinos had acted as America's friends and allies. On the other hand, the American government was unwilling to turn over to the newly organized Filipino Republic the government of the archipelago. It was felt in America, and with reason, that this Filipino government was not truly representative of all the people in the Philippines, that the Filipino leaders were untried men, and that the people themselves had not had political training and experience. The United States, having overthrown the Spanish government here, was under obligation to see that the government established in its place would represent all and do injustice to none. The Filipinos were very slightly known to Americans, but their educated class was believed to be small and their political ability unproven. Thus, no assurances were given to the Filipino leaders that their government would be recognized or that their wishes would be consulted in the future of the islands. In fact, these matters could be settled only by action of the American Congress, which was late in assembling and slow to act. The terms of peace. Spain and America were now negotiating terms of peace. These negotiations were conducted at Paris and dragged on during many critical weeks. The Filipinos were naturally very much concerned over the outcome. Finally, the American government demanded of Spain that she cede the islands to the United States and accept the sum of $20 million gold for public works and improvements which she had made. Suspicions of the Filipino leaders. These terms became known in November 1898. They served to awaken the worst suspicions of the Filipino leaders. Many believed that they were about to exchange the oppressive domination of Spain for the selfish and equally oppressive domination of America. There is reason to believe that some leaders counseled patience, and during the succeeding months made a constant effort to maintain the peace. But the radical party among the Filipinos was led by a man of real gifts and fiery disposition, Antonio Luna. He had received an education in Europe, had had some instruction in military affairs, and when in September the Filipino government was transferred to Malolos, Luna became the general-in-chief of the military forces. He was also editor of the most radical Filipino newspaper, La Independencia. New Filipino government. On January 4, 1899, President McKinley issued a special message to General Otis, commanding the armies of the United States in the Philippines, declaring that American sovereignty must be recognized without conditions. It was thought in the United States that a firm declaration of this kind would be accepted by the Filipinos, and they would not dare to make resistance. The intentions of the American president and nation, as subsequent events have proven, were to deal with the Filipinos with great liberality. But the president's professions were not trusted by the Filipinos, and the result of Mr. McKinley's message was to move them at once to frame an independent government and to decide on war. This new government was framed at Malolos, Bulacan, by a congress with representatives from most of the provinces of Central Luzon. The Malolos Constitution was proclaimed January 23, 1899, and Don Emilio Aguinaldo was elected president. The cabinet or ministry included Don Apolinario Mabini, Secretary of State, Don Teodoro Sandico, Secretary of Interior, General Baldomero Aguinaldo, Secretary of War, General Mariano Trias, Secretary of Treasury, Don Ingracio Gonzaga, Secretary of Public Instruction and Agriculture. War with the Americans. Battle of Manila. The Filipino forces were impatient for fighting, and attack on the American lines surrounding Manila began on the night of February 4th. It is certain that battle had been decided upon and in preparation for some time, and that fighting would have been begun in any case before the arrival of reinforcements from America. But the attack was precipitated a little early by the killing at San Juan Bridge of a Filipino officer who refused to halt when challenged by an American sentry. On that memorable and dreadful night, the battle raged with great fury along the entire circle of defenses surrounding the city, from Tondo on the north to Fort San Antonio de Abad, south of the suburb of Malate. Along three main avenues from the north, east, and south, the Filipinos attempted to storm and enter the capital. But although they charged with reckless bravery, and for hours sustained a bloody combat, They had fatally underestimated the fighting qualities of the American soldier. The volunteer regiments of the American Army came almost entirely from the western United States, where young men are naturally trained to the use of arms and are imbued by inheritance with the powerful and aggressive qualities of the American frontier. When morning broke, the Filipino line of attack had, at every point, been shattered and thrown back, and the Americans had advanced their positions on the north to Caloocan, on the east to the waterworks and the Marikina Valley, and on the south to Pasay. Declaration of War. Unfortunately, during the night attack and before the disaster to Filipino arms was apparent, Aguinaldo had launched against the United States a declaration of war. This declaration prevented the Americans from trusting the overtures of certain Filipinos made after this battle, and peace was not achieved. The Malolos Campaign. On March 25th began the American advance upon the Filipino capital of Malolos. This Malolos Campaign, as it is usually called, occupied 6 days and ended in the driving of the Filipino army and government from their capital. The Filipino army was pursued in its retreat as far as Calumpit, where on the southern bank of the Rio Grande de Pampanga, the American line rested during the height of the rainy season. During this interval, the volunteer regiments, whose terms of service had long expired, were returned to the States, and their places taken by regiments of the regular army. Some hard fighting had taken place during this campaign, and 2 extremely worthy American officers were killed, Colonels Egbert and Stotzenberg. The American Army. The American Army at that time, besides the artillery, consisted of 25 regiments of infantry and 10 of cavalry. Congress now authorized the organization of 24 new regiments of infantry, to be known as the 26th to the 49th Regiments of U.S. Volunteers, and 1 volunteer regiment of cavalry, the 11th, for a service of 2 years. These regiments were largely officered by men from civil life, familiar with a great variety of callings and professions, men for the most part of fine character, whose services in the months that followed were very great, not only in the field, but in gaining the friendship of the Filipino people and in representing the character and intentions of the American government. Anti-war agitators in America. Through the summer of 1899, the war was not pressed by the American general, nor were the negotiations with the Filipino leaders conducted with success. The Filipinos were by no means dismayed. In spite of their reverses, they believed the conquest of the islands impossible to foreign troops. Furthermore, the war had met with tremendous opposition in America. Many Americans believed that the war was against the fundamental rights of the Filipino people. They attacked the administration with unspeakable bitterness. They openly expressed sympathy for the Filipino revolutionary cause, and for the space of 2 years, their encouragement was an important factor in sustaining the rebellion. Spread of the insurrection. In these same summer months, the revolutionary leaders spread their cause among the surrounding provinces and islands. The spirit of resistance was prominent at first only among the Tagalogs, but gradually nearly all the Christianized population was united in resistance to the American occupation. Occupation of Negros. The Americans had meanwhile occupied Iloilo and the Visayas, and shortly afterwards the Presidios in Mindanao surrendered by the Spaniards. In Negros, also, exceptional circumstances had taken place. The people in this island invited American sovereignty, and General James Smith, sent to the island in March as governor, assisted the people in forming a liberal government, through which insurrection and disorder in that island were largely avoided. Death of General Luna. With the cessation of heavy rains, the fighting was begun again in northern Luzon. The Filipino army had its headquarters in Tarlac, and its lines occupied the towns of the provinces of Pangasinan and Nueva Ecija, stretching in a long line of posts from the Zambales Mountains almost to the upper waters of the Rio Pampanga. It was still well armed, provisioned, and resolute, but the brilliant though wayward organizer of this army was dead. The nationalist junta, which had directed the Philippine government and army, had not been able to reconcile its differences. It is reported that Luna aspired to a dictatorship. He was killed by soldiers of Aguinaldo at Cabanatuan. The campaign in northern Luzon. The American generals now determined upon a strategic campaign. General MacArthur was to command an advance up the railroad from Calumpit upon Tarlac. General Lawton, with a flying column of swift infantry and cavalry, was to make a flanking movement eastward through Nueva Ecija and hem the Filipino forces in upon the east. Meanwhile, General Wheaton was to convey a force by transport to the Gulf of Lingayen to throw a cordon across the Ilocano coast that should cut off the retreat of the Filipino army northward. As a strategic movement, this campaign was only partially successful. MacArthur swept northward, crushing the Filipino line on his front, his advance being led by the active regiment of General J. Franklin Bell. Lawton's column scoured the country eastward, marching with great rapidity and tremendous exertions. Swollen rivers were crossed with great loss of life, and the column, cutting loose from its supplies, was frequently in need of food. It was in this column that the Filipino first saw with amazement the great American cavalry horse, so large beside the small pony of the Philippines. Lawton's descent was so swift that the Philippine government and staff narrowly escaped capture. On the night of November 11th, the Filipino generals held their last council of war at Bayambang on the Rio Agno and resolved upon dispersal. Meanwhile, Wheaton had landed at San Fabian, upon the southern Ilocano coast, but his force was insufficient to establish an effective cordon, and on the night of November 15th, Aguinaldo, with a small party of ministers and officers, closely pursued by the cavalry of Lawton under the command of General Young, slipped past through the mountains of Pozo Rubio and Rosario and escaped up the Ilocano coast. Then began one of the most exciting pursuits in recent wars. The chase never slackened, except in those repeated instances when for the moment the trail of the Filipino general was lost. From Candon, Aguinaldo turned eastward through the comandancias of Lepanto and Bontoc into the wild Igorot country of the Cordillera Central. The trail into Lepanto leads over the lofty mountains through the precipitous Tila Pass. Near the summit, in what was regarded as an impregnable position, Gregorio del Pilar, little more than a boy, but a brigadier general, with a small force of soldiers, the remnant of his command, attempted to cover the retreat of his president. But a battalion of the 33rd Infantry, under Major March, carried the pass, with the total destruction of Pilar's command, he himself falling amid the slain. Capture of Aguinaldo. Major March then pursued Aguinaldo into Bontoc and thence southward into the wild and mountainous territory of Quiangan. On Christmas night, 1899, the American soldiers camped on the crest of the Cordillera, within a few miles of the Igorot village where the Filipino force was sleeping. Both parties were broken down and in dire distress through the fierceness of the fight and pursuit, but for several weeks longer, Aguinaldo's party was able to remain in these mountains and elude its pursuers. A month later, his trail was finally lost in the valley of the Cagayan. He and his small party finally passed over the exceedingly difficult trail through the Sierra Madre Mountains to the little Tagalog town of Palanan near the Pacific coast. Here, almost entirely cut off from active participation in the insurrection, Aguinaldo remained until March of 1901, when he was captured by the party of General Funston. For some weeks following the disintegration of the Filipino army, the country appeared to be pacified and the insurrection over. The new regiments arriving from the United States, an expedition was formed under General Schwan, which in December and January marched southward through Cavite and Laguna provinces and occupied Batangas, Tayabas, and the Camarines. Other regiments were sent to the Visayas and to northern Luzon until every portion of the archipelago, except the islands of Mindoro and Palawan, contained large forces of American troops. Reorganization of the Filipino Army. The Filipinos had by no means, however, abandoned the contest, and this period of quiet was simply a calm while the insurgent forces were perfecting their organization and preparing for a renewal of the conflict under a different form. It being found impossible for a Filipino army to keep the field, there was effected a secret organization for the purpose of maintaining irregular warfare through every portion of the archipelago. The islands were partitioned into a great number of districts or zones. At the head of each was a zone commander, usually with the rank of general. The operations of these men were, to a certain extent, guided by the counsel or directions of the secret revolutionary juntas in Manila or Hong Kong, but in fact they were practically absolute and independent, and they exercised extraordinary powers. They recruited their own forces and commissioned subordinate commanders. They levied contributions upon towns, owners of haciendas, and individuals of every class, and there was a secret civil or municipal organization for collecting these revenues. The zone commanders, moreover, exercised the terrible power of execution by administrative order. End of Chapter 13, Part 1. Recording by Alma Molino.